This is the beginning of EA's FIFA series. It might not look like much, but this game was absolutely revolutionary in 1993. In particular, the isometric perspective was innovative and different, and the game is surprisingly playable today. But for this game, it's not necessarily the game itself that's the story. Rather, at least I think the interesting story here is about where this game comes from. FIFA International Soccer on the Sega Mega Drive, or the Sega Genesis if you're in North America, really was a standout game for its time. It helped solidify that console as the king of the sports games consoles. Alright, technically this story started back in 1988 with an American football PC game called John Madden Football. But this game is barely playable and it really isn't worth looking at today. Now, back in 1989, the head of Sega of America, Michael Katz, was desperate for a way to get the new Sega Genesis to compete against the older Nintendo Entertainment System. Katz came up with the strategy of emphasizing sports games and went as far as to sign NFL quarterback Joe Montana to a multi-million-dollar deal. So there was some talk at that time about making a soccer game starting Pelé, but it seems that the idea was pushed back quite a bit. However, what Katz and Sega did right was to attract the interest of Electronic Arts and its Madden series. The first John Madden Football on the Sega Genesis was a big hit. There are problems with the first few versions of this game, sure. But these games were better than average for their time and were quite popular. The same month that the first Madden was released, EA also released a Genesis port of Lakers vs. Celtics, its popular PC basketball game. And 1991 saw the release of NHL Hockey, the first game in the extremely popular NHL series. But if you look closely at these games, you'll notice that there's something different between them and FIFA International Soccer. All of the earlier EA games used a more standard perspective. For Madden and the NHL games, this was a vertical perspective, designed to give the player the widest possible view. For the NBA games, this was a more standard horizontal perspective. One of the things that really made FIFA stand out was this isometric perspective. It gave the game a sort of early 3D feeling. And surprisingly, the game is easy to control with the default settings despite the unusual camera angle. Now, the isometric perspective was nothing new in video games. It had been used to create a sort of pretend 3D viewpoint for years before this FIFA game came out, but in the mid-90s it still was pretty innovative. The first really famous isometric game is Q*bert. You might also remember arcade games like Marble Madness from the mid-1980s, which had a very similar pseudo-3D feel. Of course, this perspective was common with more modern games like SimCity 2000 and Civilization 2, a game that I spent thousands of hours playing. But those two games came out after EA's first FIFA game. So, in other words, we are talking about something that was relatively new here. I've already mentioned Sensible Soccer, which was the most popular football game of the day. The bird's eye perspective works well, but the players are really small. There were also games like Kickoff that had a more top-down view. Given what the competition was like, it must have seemed really risky to give this game the unusual isometric viewpoint. But the truth is that this view actually works really well. It helps keep the action flowing and it makes it a lot easier to see things that are happening down the pitch. Now, it's not perfect, sure, but it's actually really good for a Sega game from 1993, and this really was a breath of fresh air into EA's sports game development at the time. When you play this game again, the thing that stands out the most is the sound. I'm not sure how they managed to do it, but the programmers got the crowd noises just right. The crowd builds up in anticipation as things happen in the match, which is really cool. The controls are okay, though they're a little bit awkward. The game is a little bit slow. It's an early Genesis game after all. But the crowd noise is great. Now there are some bugs, like this one where you can stand in front of the goalkeeper and take the ball right off his toe. And even if you play with the offside rule turned on, the computer will miss it most of the time. And there are a few other bugs with this game that you will notice right away. In particular, the controls are pretty questionable. It's pretty obvious without the ball. I just spammed the A and B buttons most of the time. After all, it wouldn't be an EA soccer game without sliding tackles. However, when you have the ball, things are a little bit more complicated. It seems to me like they were trying to give the player far too many options with only 3 buttons. In the end, I wind up spamming the A and C buttons when I've got the ball on offense, and I haven't had much luck in getting shots to go in. But you know, there is a chance that I just haven't played this game long enough, and compared to its contemporaries, it actually does have a pretty good flow. So Super Sidekicks 1, which came out a year earlier on the Neo Geo, is faster, but it's harder to see from this perspective. The nice thing about FIFA is that you can see a lot of the field. And actually, that's a complaint that I have about the entire Super Sidekicks series. The same goes for Konami's arcade game Soccer Superstars, which came out just a few years later. Soccer Superstars has better camera movement, sure. But the old FIFA game really shows you more of the field, at least in my opinion. And the truth is that EA's FIFA is really the game that got the ball rolling. After this one came out, there were a ton of competitors, and then things really started to advance quickly. Of course, we're going to cover some of those competing games as well. EA came out with a port of FIFA on the Super Nintendo in 1994. This is actually a really good port, and it plays faster than the original. Now, if you look closely, you will notice that the frame rate isn't quite as good as the Genesis version. However, the meters when you hold down the buttons are a lot more user-friendly than the original. Now, there's some other stuff in this game that's a little bit hard for me to test at the moment, but it is still pretty innovative. For example, you can play a 4-player game if you've got the right adapter for your system, which is something that was pretty cool at the time. There is a league mode, which is also cool, as well as standard tournaments. Unfortunately, you need a password to continue. There's no battery-backed save. This was common on those old EA console games. Most of them used password systems. But you know, the best part about this game is that it's just so easy to pick up and play. Regardless of the system, you can get a game going in a matter of seconds. You jump in and go straight to the action. It doesn't even ask you for your tactics. It might not be perfect if you're a hardcore fan of the sport, but if you're a casual fan, this is the perfect way to get in. And so there's no wonder that this game rose to the top of the Super Nintendo charts in summer 1994 in the United States, surpassing the likes of NBA Jam and Ken Griffey Jr. Presents Major League Baseball. FIFA is not a perfect game, but it really is playable, and honestly, it's a lot of fun. And in the end, really, the ability to pick up and play the game is the most important thing. Parts of this game haven't aged all that well, sure, but it's still fun to sit down and play for a few minutes even today, and it really was a breath of fresh air compared to other football games of the time.